A Jewish friend of mine was telling me the story, humorous story, of Yeshiva University in New York. Their intellectual academic prestige was rising, but they had very poor level of sports. And they thought the one they could really probably master would be rowing. But they were hopeless. And after a year or so, they decided they got to do something about this. So they sent a spy up to watch the Harvard crew on the Charles, and he hid behind a bush and watched them training. And he came back down to New York and said, simple to see why they do well. They have 8 people rowing and only 1 shouting. Now, sadly, that sort of chaos of the self-deprecating Jewish humor, if you look around much of the Christian community, there's a lot more noise than there is real light on so many of the situations. And that's why I personally love working both with Focus, but certainly with John and the Colson Center, because they're bringing light and truth to bear on so many of the public issues. I'm sure you're all grappling with things American. I want to shift the focus tonight to look at the West and the human future, not just America. As some of you know, I was born in China. In the Japanese invasion, 17 million were killed. The Chinese response was to flood the Yellow River without telling their people. Overnight, 900,000 of their own people drowned. We lived in a famine, my family and I, in which 5 million died in 3 months. We moved to Nanking, then the capital of Free China, and I remember the first 2 years of the reign of terror under Mao Zedong and the Red Army. Nanking had been brutalized in the rape of Nanking. It has suffered terribly in the war, with all the horror of China's experiences in the 30s and 40s. And yet, for all that, if you've ever been to Nanjing today, you can see the glory of the ancient capital of China. Because twice Nanjing had been the dynastic capital. In 1500, it was the largest, most prosperous city in the world. The emperor sent a fleet of ships to Africa 4 times the size of Columbus's. He sent 1 million men to build what we know as the Forbidden City in Beijing. If you'd looked out from the emperor's throne around the world, it would have been absurd to think that anyone, anywhere, would be a rival to the Middle Kingdom, China. And yet, to the Chinese surprise and shock, at the western end of the great Asian landmass, the rocky outcrop that no one expected anything to come from, suddenly a power arose that dominated the world for 500 years, including China, Europe, and the West. And when the Chinese began to regain their confidence, they had a famous conference at the Chinese Academy of the Social Sciences, basically asking what happened. Was it Western armies, or politics, or the rule of law, or the economy? All of these factors played a part, they said, but no. And they said, remember these are atheist intellectuals, the leading cause of the rise of the West was religion. Their word. Jewish scholars jumped into the argument and said, no, that's right, but not precise enough. It wasn't just religion or the Christian faith, because for anyone thinking the Christian faith had been dominant in Europe ever since 380, when the Emperor Theodosius declared Rome officially Christian. But Europe had never dominated the world. What was it? It was the Reformation. And of course, the discovery of the printing press and all that that meant with the Reformation. The Oxford Introduction to the Reformation says, the Reformation created the modern world. That, of course, would be a highly controversial statement, let's say, not just in Grand Rapids, where it would be obvious, but down in South Bend, where it might not be. In other words, if we think more carefully, clearly the Reformation was divisive. It was the third great division in Christian history. The Catholic Reformation was very powerful too. And Europe had been built up for a long time with the powerful influence of the church. You can think of the monastic movements, or the rise of the universities, Bologna, the Sorbonne, Oxford, the great European cathedrals, and the magnificent of sacred music that was coming out of Europe. But Europe had never dominated the world. Now, as people looked at that, and how the Christian faith made the West, and the West has touched the whole world, two things over the last century or so have come very clear. First, the West is the most powerful civilization in human history. Now, a culture is simply a way of life lived in common. And by a civilization, I don't mean that as a moral compliment. Rather, that you have a way of life which achieves a certain excellence in some areas and an expansion to touch many other areas and an extension so that it lasts a considerable time. And if we look at the West, you can see that it's the most powerful because every other previous civilization was relatively regional, great though some of them were. But the West is truly transforming the entire world. Think of what are called the great exports of the West: the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and nearer to our own time, technology and market economics. So even today, our greatest enemies are thriving on things they've received as essentially gifts of the West. And our greatest enemy has as his ideology an ideology that's a Christian heresy, Marxism, and so on. There's no question that the West is the most powerful civilization in history because of its impact. At the same time, people have said, it's equally obvious over the last 150 years that you have a rising chorus of voices saying the West is in decline. You see it first in Russia with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, in Switzerland with Jakob Burckhardt in the 19th century, here in America with Henry and Brooks Adams. Around the turn of the century, the fin de siècle, Karl Kraus in Vienna described the ferment of degeneration that was going on, decadence going on there, as the testbed of world destruction. Now, it's often said that the high point of the West was Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in June 1897. Her navy ruled the world. A quarter of the world was under her flag, and many of the other European countries had others. But within 4 years, she had died. And a few years after that, the man who sat next to her at the dinner celebrating her jubilee, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo, and World War I started. And World War I was the carnage which spelt the end of any pretension of Europe to being a great civilization. Then, of course, followed by the rise of totalitarianisms. And then World War II. And then the nuclear age and all that's understood by the environmental degradation and all that we see today. And you can see this mounting chorus of voices in the last century, including great scholars. The most famous, the most pessimistic, Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West in 1918. More importantly, the great Arnold Toynbee, whose book, The Study of History, was the longest book in the 20th century, several million words. Here in America, Peter M. Sorokin, or more recently, Philip Rieff, My Life Among the Deathworks, and even more recently, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, A Warning to the West. So you can see, on the one hand, this great appreciation of the Western greatness and a mounting chorus of voices saying that the West is showing signs of serious decline. Now, I believe, I'm not unique in this, that we're in what's called a civilizational moment. And what does that mean? Every civilization has an inspiration, a dynamic, a wellspring, the source that makes it what it is, whatever it is. Clearly, that in the West is the Christian faith. But every civilization comes to a point that's called the civilizational moment, when the civilization loses touch decisively with what made it great. And then there's a certain point at which it faces basically three options, although these are clearer in hindsight. First, will there be a renewal of the inspiration that made the civilization? Second, will there be a replacement by another ideology or faith, replacing the original inspiration? Or thirdly, will there be decline? And of course, if you think for a moment whether we're looking at Egypt or Mesopotamia or China or Assyria or the Greeks or the Romans or the Mayans or the Aztecs, they've all gone. Why, for a moment, do we think the West will last in any way that's different? And clearly we're at this civilizational moment. And put it very simply, almost the entire West today, in terms of the intelligentsia, has repudiated the faith that made the West. And if we're looking at the United States and the American Republic, the intelligentsia have not only repudiated the faith that made America, they've repudiated the revolution that made America, and are following today progressive and more radical ideas that are dead set against that revolution. So here we are, this extraordinary moment. The United States being the lead society of the West, but the West as a whole, in different ways, in different countries, showing signs of this civilizational moment. Now, if you read a lot of the literature on this, and people are writing and talking about it, most of the factors cited are things like economics and technology, the digital revolution and all that. What they don't talk about today is the faith that made the West. And yet there is a mounting sense that while the economics is terribly important and technology is terribly important, what humanizes them and balancing them are institutions such as the family, the church and synagogue, and the school. And of course, each of these fundamental institutions assumes and requires faith. And so to anyone who's thinking, although the arguments are about economics or technology, again and again the real issue comes back to the fundamental importance of faith. Now let me make some remarks in the light of that. First, and this isn't very controversial in an audience like this, the West owes everything to Christendom. The West is the child of Christendom. In other words, just as each of us, for better or worse, who are followers of Jesus, are an embodiment of faith and the attempt to live out our Christian life, for better or worse, sometimes well, sometimes not so well, so the West is a historical, geographical embodiment of a culture trying to live out the Christian faith, and there's not much argument about that. Now, when I say that, of course, we owe an immense amount to previous civilizations. You can think quickly of what we owe to the Greeks. An incredible amount. Literature, drama, science, democracy. You can go on down the line. Think of all that we owe to the Romans. Above all, governance. But things like roads and even central heating. And you can see we are really, in many ways, the champions and the guardians of that classical civilization that was handed over to us. But Rome and Greece were regional. They were basically Mediterranean powers, apart from Julius Caesar's incursion into Gaul briefly. Whereas the West is far, far wider than that. And what made them West was the conversion of the barbarian people from the 5th to the 10th centuries, which was their coming to faith in Jesus, for better, and sometimes, sadly, a lot worse. But the West is the embodiment of Christendom. Now, when I say that, I don't mean Christendom proper, the Holy Roman Empire and things like that. We include, of course, the Christian consensus. So the United States never had anything like Christendom. You never even had an established church like most of the European countries, but there was still a powerful Christian consensus. And that's what matters, and that, of course, is what has gone. Move on. Clearly, our lead rival, the lead suitor, as it were, to be the leading faith of the West following the collapse of the Christian faith, as they see it, is Enlightenment secularism. Now think for a minute, there have always been atheists, secularists. You have an atheist in Psalm 14. You have in Greece Democritus, in Rome Lucretius. But atheists and secularists were always very much a minority. Most people were religious, whatever they believed. But the Enlightenment changed all that. And we've got to see that the Enlightenment grew up very much in reaction to us. And the Enlightenment, I put it simply like this: it is a parasite on our best, and it is a protest against our worst. So if you look at all the impulses to the Enlightenment from the 18th century down to today, you can see three great impulses above all. The first one, very important, we don't want God. Now that, of course, comes out of the French Revolution. You think of the cry of the encyclopedist Diderot, which was picked up by the Jacobins in the streets: we will never be free until we've strangled the last king with the guts of the last priest. A little gory, but unpack the idea. Church and state, throne and altar, in total collusion. Both very corrupt and both very oppressive. And the revolution throws off both, and what the French call laïcité, enthroning reason instead of the Lord. But you can see that the Enlightenment is a protest against our worst. And I say, sadly, as a European, the major reason for the Enlightenment is revulsion against the corruptions and the oppressions of the European state churches, supremely in France, but in many other countries too. Now that, of course, is something that's never touched America because of the genius of the First Amendment. And faith has flourished here, not despite disestablishment, but because of it. It was voluntary, based on the dictates of conscience. But if we think of the scandals of the church in the last generation, you have an American equivalent, milder, thank God, at the moment, but a definite equivalent of that European revulsion against faith, which has created secularism. We don't want God. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn puts it simply, animosity to God is as central to the radical left as their politics and their economics. And we have to say with great sorrow, we have partly caused that. And we need to repent for it when it happens today and say the good news of evangelicals becomes bad news for many people and becomes a toxic notion, the way certain Christians have behaved. We don't want God. The second impulse, we don't need God. You can see this particularly in the northern European countries prospering through the Reformation. We're doing very well, thank you. Why on earth do we need faith when we can do it all ourselves? But the third impulse, coming much more recently through the discovery of DNA in the 50s, we can replace God. And you can see from Crick and so on onwards, down to people like Yuval Noah Harari today, we can now direct evolution. We are the godlings on planet Earth. As Yuval Harari says, a Jew writing from Jerusalem, but as an atheist, science can do better than the Old Testament God. But put those together. We don't want God. We don't need God. And we can replace God. And you can see very powerful secularist forces that are a philosophy, yes, but a spiritual dynamic too. But move on beyond that. Secularism is against us, but it's not against the West. Secularism bids to be the rival to us to lead the West. But today we have a different situation, because beyond secularism we have a number of ideologies which are emphatically against us as followers of Jesus, but they're also radically against the West. And so you have what the historians call a war of the worlds with these various ideologies. I'll just mention them briefly. I know our dear magnificent Glenn Sunshine has covered these well, and Colson Center and John covered these well, so I can almost talk in shorthand. But let me just broaden the picture by putting in not just secularism against us, but in favor of the West, with these other ideologies which are against us and the West. The first is what's called, from the European perspective, the red wave. And that's confusing because here in America, you've turned things upside down. Most of the rest of the whole world, the red is left. And conservatives are blue. But here in America, you've turned that round. A little confusing. But by the red wave, I simply mean the two forms of Marxism. Classical Marxism, not our principal danger today. More importantly, the other one, cultural Marxism. Now put those together. I'm still surprised as a European how few Americans, until certain things bubble up, say I live in Virginia, suddenly we had CRT, critical race theory, bubbling up in Loudoun County, and helping Glenn Youngkin become our governor. Wonderful friend, wonderful Christian brother. Many Christians had never heard of CRT till then. But of course, what's behind CRT? It's behind Black Lives Matter, it's behind Antifa, it's behind Occupy Wall Street. In other words, you've got a ever-morphing, swarming varieties of the radical left, and they all go back to the same place. Your own great historians of Marxism, like, say, James Billington, the Librarian of Congress, points out that the French Revolution only lasted 10 years in France. 1789, the revolution. 1799, Napoleon comes and says the revolution is over, a dictator. But while the revolution is over in France, and it never succeeded after that, the 1830s, 1848, Les Mis and all that sort of thing, it's not a failure, because like a gigantic volcanic explosion, the French Revolution's flowed out in different lava flows ever since. The first one, in the 19th century, is the one followed least, what's called revolutionary nationalism. Now that's the least important for our purposes, although we can see that that revolutionary nationalism has become very, very important in China. And very important if you look at things coming, say, from the Davos World Economic Forum and so on, because you see revolutionary nationalism morphing into a revolutionary globalism. But we can ignore that one for this evening. The second lava flow, designed in the 19th century by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, was communism, revolutionary socialism. Now, many people thought that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, that was the end of that one. Not at all. The third branch is the one that's affecting America. Revolutionary liberationism, or cultural Marxism, or neo-Marxism, or user-friendly Marxism, various words are used. And that goes back to Antonio Gramsci, sitting in a jail under Mussolini, writing thousands of pages of his revolutionary ideas. And he shifts Marxism from the revolution in Russia to the idea that what was important was not so much economics, but culture. And what matters is winning the hearts and minds of cultural gatekeepers. Now, his ideas were picked up by the Frankfurt School. And the importance being that in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the leader of the Frankfurt School in this country was Herbert Marcuse at the University of San Diego. His essay, for instance, are behind the cancel culture. But more importantly, at the end of the 60s, actually the same year that I first visited Calvin and the US at large, it was in 67, 68 that he and some other radicals called for a long march through the institutions. Now, there are some of you who remember 1968. Martin Luther King assassinated. Senator Kennedy assassinated. So-called police riots at the Chicago Convention. And 100 American cities were ablaze. Far, far worse than 2020. But, the radicals said, and here's the important point, they knew they wouldn't win in the streets. So they called for a Mao-style long march through the institutions. Go around, slowly, persuasively, incrementally. Infiltrate colleges and universities, the press and the media, what they called the culture industry, Hollywood and entertainment, and then sweep round and win the culture. So here we are, more than 50 years later. Who would ever believe? I mean, Europeans are still startled. We would have thought the last fortresses of American conservatism would be business and the military. And now you have woke business, woke finance, and increasing inroads of the wokeism in the military. In other words, the Long March has been incredibly successful. So, if you summarize what I'm saying now, you could say the challenge facing America, you could put in 3 words. Revolution, oligarchy, homecoming. What do I mean? Revolution, obviously what I've just been describing, the radical left. And I would say, please, Lord, no. Oligarchy, I haven't said much about, but a very important other topic. As you've had a hollowing out of traditional American liberalism and a squeezing of the middle class and a growing gap between the elites and ordinary people, much of America, and scholars have followed this, looks more like an oligarchy than a democracy. And one of the ironic contributions of President Trump is that he's highlighted that by speaking to the so-called forgotten people. He's shown this enormous growing gap between ordinary people and the elites and the experts who know best as to how the rest of us should live. Now we could go on from there. That's the red wave. Far more quickly, the rainbow wave. That was the LGBTQ revolution. Now again, many people don't understand the roots of it. They think it goes back to Hugh Hefner and the Playboy and the pill and permissiveness and the 1960s. No, no. The sexual revolution goes back to the same quarter in Paris as the political revolution, the Palais Royal. And anyone who's been following their ideas from the beginning, for example, you look at the 1920s, Wilhelm Reich, who gave us the term sexual revolution, he lays it all out in a little book. What they're about is quite clear. They want to subvert, revolution, 3,000 years of civilization, 1,000 years of Judaism and 2,000 years of the Christian faith. And their two enemies, he's quite open about it. One is the church, and the other, the family. And so he says, H.G. Wells says this before him, turn of the century. We want to have sex education at 3 and 4. Why? Because you're sidelining parents. This isn't something new. Why were Christians surprised? They've spelt out what they were going to do nearly a century ago. We should have been forewarned and forearmed, but many people weren't. And I would say to you, as we look at some of the extremes, obviously we're facing the political dynamics of the sexual revolution, with transgenderism currently being the vanguard edge. But if you listen to some of it, it may interest some of you, the deepest dynamics, I think, are spiritual and religious. Because there's a return to paganism, and androgyny has always been at the heart of paganism. And the idea that transcends Hinduism and Buddhism and all the world's religions and lifts us to a grand tantric orgiastic harmony, partly through sex and so on. Something very profound is political, but something even more profound is spiritual and profoundly religious and pagan. But follow it closely. The third wave is the black wave. In other words, radical Islamism. Now, we only look at that, or tend to look at that, when things like 9/11 happened. But of course, if you've been following this, it goes back again much earlier. Much of the lethal toxicity of Islamism in its radical forms goes back to the marriage of Islamism and Nazism in the 1930s. When the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was invited by Hitler, and they both together determined to exterminate the Jews. And Hitler supported the Grand Mufti all through the war. And they had in their sights more than 1 million Jews in North Africa and other parts of the Middle East, so that when Nazism spread, the final solution would spread. Thank God it didn't. But you can see from then onwards that radical, deadly combination of Nazism and radical Islamism and a hatred of the Jewish people and extermination. Now that's confusing to people today because the people who support, say, Palestine pretend that they're progressives and on the left. But actually no one is really fooled by that because there's a same combination that's so deadly there. And remember, their little Satan is what? Israel. But what's their big Satan? America and the West. I mentioned one other ideology rather quickly, and that's what I call the gold wave. And this begins not as an ideology, it grows into one, I think, but it begins just with ordinary corruption. You can think of elite American business people and political people who have so enamored with profit and success through China that they no longer stand for, say, human rights. And that includes not only very famous political leaders, but sporting leaders like, say, LeBron James, who's very strong on certain things in this country, but very critical of anything that might be critical of China when his sneakers are being sold. And these things aren't funny when you think of how many of your elites or ordinary politicians have just left Washington and become lobbyists for this, that, the other group and made fortunes. Why are almost no American former political leaders poor? With many of them, they've got that money, through China. And clearly you have an enormous weakness in terms of reaching out. Now, the danger, we haven't time to go into that, but when that touches, say, the global resetters and what I call revolutionary globalism, it becomes extremely dangerous because once again it undermines everything that the American Republic stands for. Now, what we don't have time for tonight, and I'm running out of time now, quickly, I'll just draw this to a conclusion. Mention things very, very quickly without expounding on them. 4 things. First, we need to pray for revival. If you look in the scriptures and down through history, God's awakenings, his revivals, are part of the engines of his sovereign working in history. You think, for instance, in America, of what the first awakening did for the American Revolution. Or you think of the second awakening in the 19th century and its extraordinary impact on reforms like abolition. Revival touches parts of society that no action and activism can touch. I'll never forget talking to a congressman one day, and he said, you know, if there's a flood, and he was obviously thinking your Dutch background here, if there's a flood, he said, a small boy can be a hero and put his finger in the dike. He said, but I'm looking out in America, and what I see is a mudslide. We can and must, John mentioned voting next Tuesday, we can and must do all that we can do. But let's be clear, when we're looking at the church and parts of society, there are things we will never touch apart from a sovereign outpouring of the Spirit of God in conviction and renewal. Secondly, we must be unafraid to bring back the question of faith as a factor in all our public discussion. My background is sociology. Not only is faith, our faith in Christ, cancelled as a serious issue in most public discussion, it's not much of a real issue in the church. Almost every week I read these things. Oh, are you worried by this? Barna says 51% now this. Everything Gallup tells you, everything that Barna tells you about our attendances and practices and all that, that is nothing but our human behavior. None of that has anything to do with reality. What's the final reality? The presence and the power of the Lord himself. And we've got to make that the first factor in our thinking and know how to bring that into public life in ways that matter. Like I said earlier, people realize that to counter economics and to counter technology, if they're not to be runaway and dangerous and damaging, you need the family. You need churches and synagogues. You need good schools. And what inspires those? Faith. Faith is the absolute essential, indispensable factor in a civilizational moment. Third, again, you think of all these things in much greater depth. Explore the great precedents we have for a civilizational moment in our history. 2 of them are very obvious. We have no idea when, say, Mesopotamia started to decline or the Chinese. No, they're beyond us. Maybe specialist historians could tackle that, but most of us can't. I certainly couldn't. But there are 2 obvious civilizational moments in our history that are very crucial, and we should explore them for all they're worth. One is the whole period around 586 BC. In other words, the siege and destruction of Israel, God's judgment. And of course, it's magnificently covered by the Hebrew prophets. We should be exploring those, the lessons, the pluses, the minuses, the false reformations, and so on, to see what's really needed to live in a time like ours. The other one, equally obvious, is 410 AD, the fall of Rome. And this time, of course, the greatest Christian prophet is St. Augustine. You take his City of God. And all the challenges of living in a time when Rome started to decline and the pagans are blaming the Christians, and Christians are discouraged because they thought Rome and the gospel are now together. They'd spread and bring the gospel to the whole world. This would be the kingdom. And then Rome goes and collapses. And Christians are blamed for it. And St. Augustine wrestles with these great issues, and they're no more complicated than the issues that are swirling around us today. But the final thing, of course, is tying it all together. The renewal of America and the renewal of the West depends on the renewal of faith in America and the West. And that's surely what we're all about. Whether it's our daily faithfulness in our callings and our action wherever we live, or it's our prayer to the sovereign Lord of history to ask him to do in his mercy what we know we cannot do. What a generation. Think of David's men who read the signs of the times. Think of St. Paul's magnificent tribute to King David. He served God's purpose in his generation. We have the awesome privilege of living in one of the hinge moments of history. Because if the West declines, the whole future of humanity is called into question in certain ways. Our faith is the key to the moment in which we live. By God's grace, let's honor him by the way we live in trust and obedience to bring glory to his name. Thank you.
Well, I hope you have found this discussion not only inspiring, but also informative. Christians have to be able to think, especially in this constantly changing culture, from a Christian worldview. To learn more and to find more discussions, please visit lighthousevoices.org. That's lighthousevoices.org.